Okay, we will slowly start. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out here on this Wednesday afternoon, evening to Civic in Istanbul. I mean, it's a great pleasure to be here, partly because we have been instrumental or been part of the process of making this underground space happen. Thank you for coming underground, and we're also looking forward to come back up in the fresh air. So, but thanks for coming. We're here partly to hear Simon talk, but I'll also just give a kind of a brief explanation of the greater topic we are engaging here. So this is Multiple, a couple of days ago, where we are trying to make let's say, a better piece of city by rerouting some traffic. Very simple, actually, but takes a lot of effort planning up front. This is how, if it moves on, let's see. Oops. This is how it looks today. I don't think if you know any too much lighter. I have to invite you to come up and look at the screen. But basically, we have been able to claim 400 square meters, 600 square meters of the city back to public space. So it's not only parking, but actually a place where people can gather, relax in a district that otherwise doesn't have any, let's say, public space left. What's happening here is actually to the effort of a lot of people, so not only us as Superpool, but it's XX Institute, Bernard van Leer, Foundation NACTO, BO Belediye, IKCW, Multiple, Sultan Beyliği, and Stadia Municipality. So there is a lot of partners in the project, and this is just some of them. There is also several other universities involved, other NGOs. But we're very proud of being part of a project that actually tries, with our own hands, to improve the city. Like, I've been out there today painting with a broom, holding back traffic at the same time. But it really requires, it seems like, to be on the ground for us if we want to change something. We cannot just be here talking or in front of our computers. And I will encourage anyone who has the time to come out and check it out on Friday between 2 and 5. If anyone wants to know more exactly where it is, either check Superpool's Facebook page, there's an event posting there, or come and talk to Elger and me afterwards. But that's just self-promotion. We're actually here to talk about Simon, and we're very happy that Simon accepted to come and share what he's doing in Tirana. So Simon is an architect and educator based in Tirana, Albania. He's the director of something I have a hard time pronouncing, but what's called Quadra Medine, something like that. It's a non-profit research center that aims to support or work with local governments to develop policy and practices to improve the health and well-being of families in the city, I should say, right? He's also the founding director of Atelier Albania Academy, an experimental academic initiative exploring the future of livelihoods in rural regions in balance with the environment. It was exhibited at the Albanian Pavilion at the 15th Venice Architecture Biennial. Sorry, I skipped. It was a curator of I Have Left You the Mountain, and it was exhibited at the Albanian Pavilion at the Venice Biennial. It's now held at Castello di Rivoli as a permanent part of their collection. Simon, I am leaving the table to you, and I'll try to see if I can switch the presentations. Simon, all yours.
Okay. Does this work? Okay. Hello. Okay. So this quote is a joke. So I was hoping that you would laugh already by now. I'm going to talk tonight about education and the city. It's something that I work a lot with in Tirana, and it's something that I have a lot in common with the Superpool team here in Istanbul. And it's an important part of our practice, and it's something that I don't get nearly enough time to really think about. So I want to thank Superpool and the organizers tonight for the chance to develop a little bit of the kind of, let's say, academic side of the urban planning practice that we do in Tirana. Okay, so can you see this? It's really important that you see this image also. Shoot. Okay. Well, let me describe what's going on here. Basically, this is a pedestrian street. This is a walking street in Naples. I took this picture about a week ago. We don't have Nico's not here, huh? No. Okay. That's good, because I'm saying bad things about his city. So what's going on here? This is a pedestrian street with and there's a child driving a miniature car down the middle of the street, and it's a power wheel. You know, it has a battery, and I think the father is actually operating it with a remote control. But so I think, you know, on one hand the scene is very harmless. It's just a kid, right, having fun in a way. But it's also a bit horrifying when we think about the future of this child's attachment to his car. And when we think about statistics about the amount of death and destruction caused by cars in cities, and the kind of urgency that is required to get people to stop driving. When we see an image like this, when I see an image like this, it also really freaks me out, and I find it really actually disturbing. A statistic from WHO: road crashes cost low and middle income countries like Albania, where I live and work, $65 billion annually. That exceeds the amount of total development aid that they receive, right? So the car alone is undermining any kind of aid investment in low and middle income countries. That's crazy, right? But here's the thing. What I want to do is, I think our first. So what's the problem here? What I think our tendency is to say this is the problem of the parents. We would tend to blame the parents here, right? Like, the parents have bought this thing for the kid. They're encouraging this practice. The kid didn't necessarily know that this car existed before his parents maybe showed it to him, etc. But what I want to do tonight is I want to, for a second, pause and say, think about how this is not the parents' fault. In fact, this is not a parenting issue per se. This is an issue of the city. And if I showed you a picture of a full-size SUV pulled up on a sidewalk, that would be a city issue, right? Because the city police would come, they would give them a ticket, all the people around this person would sort of give them a shaming look, they would feel embarrassed, and hopefully it wouldn't happen again. But here's the thing, we don't think about the behavior of kids as a city issue. We think about the behavior of kids as a parenting issue. And especially when they're, maybe that's better. Especially when they're a toddler, especially when they're very young, the behavior and the habits that form when you're very young are not considered to be the responsibility of the city. For example, in this scene, was there signage at the height that a toddler could see, or was there, and was that signage in a kind of visual language that the toddler could apprehend or appreciate? No, of course not. So the behavior of a child in the public realm is not governed by the city. In the eyes of the city, the toddler is invisible. And that is an issue that exists in cities today, but it's something that a lot of thinkers on the left have approached deliberately, historically, dating back all the way into the 18th century, where they pose the city as the teacher. So it's not the parents' responsibility, it's not the school's responsibility per se, but the city is the teacher, and it's the city's responsibility to raise generations. That is a really important precedent for the work that we do in Urban95. Because in the Urban95 program is essentially asking cities to respond with a physical environment to raise children in better ways, right? So what we do every day is very much has this lineage that I want to take a little bit of time tonight to explore. So I'm going to go over some kind of examples of this and then sort of intersperse the work that we do. In Tirana at the moment, or let's say for the past 4 years or so, there's kind of a couple major things that we're working on. The city is building 17 new schools, 17 new primary schools all at once. The school system is really over capacity. There's not a lot of space. They haven't built schools recently, so they're building a lot of schools all at once, all throughout the city, in places where schools haven't previously been. And then at the same time, there's a program that the mayor announced this summer called the 100 Neighborhoods. And that is a local planning at the neighborhood level for families, specifically infants, toddlers, and caregivers, that talks about access to green space close to where people live. So this is an initiative on the part of the city that we're involved with. So on the one hand, you've got the new primary schools, you've got the neighborhood planning, and then, part of the reason that this is all happening is because statistics like this exist, which 70% of families in Tirana don't live within a 10-minute walk to green space. And, studies show that when you don't live that close, then you don't go very often, which is a problem. So here are 55 neighborhoods in Tirana. Each one of these neighborhoods is centered on a primary school. So the primary school is the kind of central node of the neighborhood, and then what happens is sort of four main elements. This is our proposal for how a neighborhood should be organized. The school should become a park. So the city should enter into a joint use agreement where the public can access the schoolyard in afternoons and weekends. That should be connected to informal routes, or what we call trails, that run through the neighborhood. There should be a series of pocket parks, and then the road directly connected to the school itself should turn into a kind of linear plaza, or a sheshi. These four elements, kind of in conjunction, create the node of a kind of community hub or community center in the middle of a neighborhood where people live. Outside of so instead of a retail center, let's say, which is typically the model that we think of when we think about kind of neighborhood hubs, this is basically a park and kind of public space. So, it has certain, oh God, you really can't see that at all. Okay. Yeah, so, you can see essentially on the left side there, top left, that's a school connected to the sheshi here. So it's kind of a continuous space. The whole, as much as possible, the territory is turned into a kind of an accessible park. In the schoolyard itself, there's a program of planting, so shade is a really important part of this. It's all about natural materials, so not so much plastic and metal, but really bringing climbable, playable stone into the schoolyards. We were interested in this stuff because it's not really easy to vandalize. Vandalizing a big rock doesn't really make nearly as much sense as a political act. Lots of sand and kind of all the key elements, a lot of which have been really pioneered, let's say, by the Superpool team. And so we think that amenities like this close to home will really create radically different childhoods if you have this. So, sorry, let me go back. One more thing before I move on. In meetings in Tirana, when you work on something like this, you're sitting in a meeting and you're presenting you're discussing these ideas. So often, I hear things like, people in Tirana are poorly educated and they won't get this. Or this won't work because people don't care about public space, they just care about their car, they just care about driving, they only care about themselves. There's no appreciation of the public realm. And the argument is based in an idea of education or lack of education. And so this already is coming sort of back to the point here about how is the city responsible for bringing a kind of education, kind of civic understanding. Michael Young, who was the founder of the Labour Party in Britain and a pioneer of neighborhood planning, once said this about schools. I think in your lifetime, we will see the end of schools as we know them. Instead, there will be a community center with the doors open 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, where anybody can wander in and out of the library, workshops, sports center, self-service store, and bar. In 100 years' time, the compulsory attendance laws for children to go to school may have gone the same way as the compulsory laws for attendance at church. So again, already in 1970s, Michael Young is talking about the school really is the city, and the city the teacher, meaning there's no person anymore. There's no parent, there's no human involved. It's a civic duty of these places. Okay, so most of the thinkers historically about alternative schooling and kind of these ideas that Michael Young was already talking about in the 70s kind of begin with a deep dissatisfaction with the status quo of state education. So state education is this kind of formal, book learning, didactic, the kind of philosophy of education where a student is an empty vessel and there's just knowledge being poured into their head. All of these thinkers are really running counter to that, especially in the 18th century. Very much the church was involved in education. So William Godwin in 1783 was going to open a school. He was an educator and he wanted to open a small school. And this was the pamphlet, this was the text on the pamphlet that he was issuing around town to try to get people to sign up for the school. And it's this kind of rant, right? This is the kind of classic mode of being against state education. So, you know, unintelligible jargon, rigid slavery, the language is very harsh. 100 years later, the same sentiment remained. So, Mikhail Bakunin, who was a kind of contemporary of Marx, on the anarchist side of the kind of socialism, communist, anarchist divide, wrote this, talking about the atomization of the school. So again, no more schools. They'll just be popular academies in which neither pupils nor masters will be known, where the people will come freely to get, if they need it, free instructions, and in which, rich in their own experience, again, they have something to offer as well. They're not just students. Even if you're a kid, you also have something to offer. They will teach in their turn many things to the professors, who will bring them knowledge which they lack. This will be a mutual instruction, an act of intellectual fraternity. So I think a beautiful idea of what education can be, right? It's not one way, it's both ways, it's mutual. And very much as well kind of the way that you can think about education happening from from person to city. There are a couple of schools, sort of more formal schools that have existed. Francisco Ferrer started a school in 1901 in Barcelona called La Escuela Moderna. But in the same way that the previous thinkers were talking about schools, he really thought about the school as something which shouldn't really exist. The school should just barely be there. It's essentially a place where people can come, but they don't have to show up on time. There's no rigid timetable. They sort of make their own curriculum. They spend a lot of time out in the city. They go to museums, they go to the workshops. They're spending a lot of time understanding the city. It's not a teacher, there's a kind of facilitator who is bringing them around and somehow allowing education to occur, but it's not the person who, again, is giving the education to them. So again, a major emphasis on learning by doing. So this is something that Gregor's just mentioned. Today this is a common practice among planning, right? You go and you just do it. But this wasn't always the way things were. This has a very long tradition within educational philosophy. And then also, Ferrer was very passionate about his vision of the school being an embryo of a future society. So sort of practicing process and practicing a certain model of work that you wish to multiply or emulate out in the world on a larger scale, but actually doing that kind of work in a pure process on a small scale too. Okay, so then there's a very interesting figure called Colin Ward. Has anybody ever heard of these people, by the way? Yeah, not so much. Okay, Colin Ward? Okay, cool, nice. I'm excited to be introducing you to Colin Ward. He's a pretty amazing guy. He is an architecture critic. He's an architect, I believe, an architecture critic, a teacher, and an anarchist writer, all in one. He was really, he had a job in the 1950s and 60s. He just worked in a primary school. He was a teacher. And he thought about education really as in a way, he thought that society did not have enough adults who were educated in urban issues, so that, and without them, basically, society becomes apathetic and kind of bad city making happens, bad development, et cetera, because we don't have enough well-educated adults to kind of counteract it. So he was all about educating people about city building, city making, but from a very, very young age. He said, this should be happening in elementary school from the time that you're super young. So he had all of these ideas about, again, like the previous people that we've talked about, bringing them out into the city, bringing them on field trips, having the city become the school. In the 70s, he was the editor of something called the Bulletin of Environmental Education, B. B was he worked on volunteer basis, but B was produced by the National Council of Housing. So the National Council of Housing of Britain had a newsletter called B, which was distributed to teachers. Incredible, right? About environmental education. And during the time that he was the editor of B, he was traveling around the country speaking to teachers. So he was lecturing to audiences only of instructors of little kids, talking about the relationship between education, citizenship, and cities. So, like a lot of his predecessors, and he was really a writer, and he was really a scholar of these things, so the writing that he does leans heavily on all of the figures that I've already kind of talked about, but he saw the school as a thing which should be just really radically open and fully integrated into the community. In 1978, he wrote about, the absurdity that schools kept getting larger and larger and kind of better, with better amenities inside of them for students, and yet they remained locked and closed most of the time, right? So, opens at 8, closes at 3. 80% of the time, they're inaccessible to people, and he thought that this was really crazy. So he started talking about a radically different concept. So, quote, this leads to a different concept of the school. It is no longer an isolated building surrounded by playgrounds and fences. It is instead a community facility, set among the shops and public buildings in the center of a district. There is no school hall. A hall used for every purpose is used by the school when it needs it. There is no dining hall. The children use a cafe open to the public and behave accordingly. There is no gymnasium. The school uses the sports hall open to all. There is no school library. The public library has a far greater stock. Among the shops and offices and the district center are scattered the classrooms and laboratories, which are also used by other organizations. The daily lives of the community and its children are inextricably mixed, just as they were for most people throughout history. So, we're starting to see a theme here, I think, with the way that people are thinking about this. So, interestingly, Albania has a model called School as Community Center, which was written in 2014 and passed as law, that basically provides for a very similar model. I'll read you some of the language from all of the things that we've been looking at so far. So the program started out, and I think there were 66 pilot schools around the country. In 2017, it was like up to like something like 250. I think today there's something in 300 schools around the country have some kind of program within them called School as Community Center. This is a photo of a school in Tirana that I took. A lot of them have these, can you see this at all? Okay. A lot of them have kind of like, NGO or agency partners that fund them, but this was actually sort of the beginning of a lot of our work that we do, so kind of understanding the incredibly rich potential of the School as Community Center as a document, and then going and discovering that it was, extremely underperforming, let's say. And of course, that's because it just doesn't have any funding. So it doesn't matter what you do, it just really doesn't have any money. The way that it works now is basically every School as Community Center program has one teacher from that school who's in charge of running it. And that teacher, if they normally would have 40 hours paid week, they get 32 hours paid week as teacher, and then they just give that extra 8 to them to run the School as Community Center. But of course that's no good because they end up just working all the time, and so they're not very active. But a lot of the aims of the document of the School as Community Center sound a lot like what Ward was calling for 40 or 50 years before. So the School as Community Center initiative embeds democratic values, ensures social, emotional, and health welfare of students, and engagement and development of the community. The initiative enables possibilities for joint decision-making, respect for diversity, and the use of community resources in supporting the schools. So I find this incredible because what it does, basically what it's proposing is is breaking down the non-physical barriers of the school and allowing community use of the resources of the school, and vice versa. So like if you go to one of these programs in the afternoon, here's one. This is basically like an after-school program. These kids are learning how to weave. Some neighbor from the neighborhood decided to offer a weaving class, maybe in a traditional manner, maybe not, but they basically go there like three times a week after school for a couple hours. So, but this is the beginning of something which I found very promising. Adults can come and use the space for computer classes. So parents who maybe don't have access to a computer or maybe don't know how to type, can make a resume, et cetera. So the school really becomes a resource for the community, which is really something. So the physical space of the school is not at all disturbed. There's just a gate and there's a security guard who stands there. But conceptually, the school is quite open to the community, according to this document. And then also the document says explicitly, where school, family, community partnership is built, and a place where cooperation is helping the development of the full potential of each student. That's the explanation. The initiative aims at transforming the schools into premises and spaces serving the community, and vice versa. The community becomes an important partner that supports the school. That also means like parents teaching stuff, like the neighbor who came and, a student receives an enriched education not by a staff member of the Ministry of Education any longer, but is receiving an education from someone who happens to live in the neighborhood on the site of the school. So both of these people are able to meet and share knowledge on the site of a piece of land which is owned by the state. So that's really, it's a significant thing, even if it is very humble in its way. Then this Cheveria Zenevze, that's student government. So there's two things that also come along with Schools Community Center, which are very cool. Basically, two boards are created. At every school, there are two new boards that are created. One of parents. So the parents' board is called the voice of the community in the school. So anybody from the neighborhood can join this board and actually enter into kind of decision-making responsibilities within the school, even though maybe they don't even have kids there. They don't have to. They can just be anybody. But they're now in the school and they have some say, which I find very interesting. And they have to be consulted about the budget, which is also really, really interesting. And then, in addition to that, there's a student government that's created. So a body of students voluntarily get a kind of prominence within the school and also some kind of decision-making power within the decisions that are made about the school. And I think maybe also that includes even budgeting. So then Stefano Boeri, maybe you've heard of this architect based in Milan, won the competition to design the first lot of new schools. So the 17 new schools that I was talking about in the beginning have been tendered, and the winning architect is Stefano Boeri. And here's part of here's a proposal of his for the first school, which he calls a 24-hour school. So here's this concept coming back, right? We talked about, I think, somebody in the beginning was talking about a 12-hour school. Ward was talking about the school that never closes. And now we have Boeri in 2018 talking about this building, which is open 24 hours for the community and has this kind of long list of activities that sort of everybody can access, right? So I actually did want to talk about this book just because we are underground right now, and this book takes place underground. But basically the so-called utopia of the Center Beaubourg was originally written by a Swiss sociologist called Alfred Meister. Alfred Meister was the student of Jean Piaget, if anybody knows who that is. So already we've got this kind of strange and very interesting collision of worlds between radical sociology and pedagogy. And this book is very funny. This book is quite whimsical and talks about the possibility of a kind of alternative social center built 53 floors worth of open space that exists underneath the Pompidou. So the main character is playing around one evening with a science experiment. He would like to hollow out the paper inside of a book so that he can store his gun. And he wants to do it very fast. So he comes up with this science experiment, and it works. And he realizes very quickly that that experiment can be scaled to the size of the site of the Pompidou. So basically, he empties out, so he sort of zaps, and he empties out this massive cavern underneath of the Pompidou Center. Somehow he constructs all these floors, and the two centers happen to open and be inaugurated the same night. And the book sort of begins there. Quote, "While the president and other dignitaries of public education and cultural affairs strode around the upper levels and solemnly inaugurated the rooms of the Center of Industrial Creation, the public library, and booths for the sale of artistic reproduction, those down below aimed at a sound system and an excessive amount of chalk to allow the participants to mark eventual decisions taken by the inauguration on the wall." The person who invented this center downstairs is called Gustave. So in Gustave's inaugural speech, he says, around 4,000, so this is happening simultaneously, around 4,000 people had gathered, especially youngsters. Gustave says, "There are another 53 levels underneath this one, all equipped like this, which means they are illuminated, ventilated, but without division walls, except for the toilets." Laughter. "All these levels are destined for the culture that you will be doing, because I don't have a preconceived idea of culture, nor the power to impose one, and I don't even know what culture really is. Everything in this house, or this whole, whatever you prefer to call it, must be decided together. What we mean by culture, as well as the contents and methods on how to organize such cultural activities. Regroup yourselves. On every level there are empty spaces that are illuminated and open 24 hours a day." So again, we have this kind of recurring theme of this space somehow in the middle of a city whose responsibility it is to act as a place of both creation and education. Now, one of the most entertaining writers within this tradition of all, actually easily the most entertaining of the writers within this tradition, is Charles Fourier, who was writing, he's called a utopian socialist. Has anybody ever heard of this guy? Charles Fourier? Yeah. I should have written it on the slide because you should know this guy. I didn't want to show any image of him or what he designed because it's totally wrong and like just not really what you want to look at. It's like very dated and it looks like a prison sort of. But this is what, I think this is a picture I took in Tirana. I think this is more what perhaps he had been after. But basically, Fourier was very interested in education as a utopianist, as someone who's thinking about utopia and thinking about how we reach a particular version of society. How do we get there? Of course, education is key. And so he thought a lot about education and a lot about childhood and a lot about the role that the city or the society can play in making sure that sort of everybody comes up with the same education and values, let's say. So he, you know, similar to the Finns of today, he believed that books and sort of classroom learning should be postponed as long as possible. Basically, you should allow a kid to just play and understand the world and their body and how they fit within that world for a long time before you ever sit them down and ask them to sit still inside of a classroom. So he said that from age 5 to 10, in his conception, he wrote these really long, very detailed descriptions of how his society would operate, and I'll read from some of them. From age 5 to 10, for him, the ages of 5 to 10 is the time when the senses are really coming alive. So he wanted to organize a kind of education that was especially for taste, smell, sight, and hearing. And what he thought was that all the 5 and 10-year-olds in the society should be broken into 2 tasks. One would become very good at cookery, and one would become very good at opera, because those are the 2 things which could keep you occupied and basically channel all of your development into a productive activity for society, instead of being told to sort of sit still, etc. And basically, like, within those 2 occupations, by the way, these people are working. So if you're involved in cookery, you're in the field. You're either farming or you're in the kitchen. You're involved really in the production of food, and that is how. This is another theme that we see often in this literature. That is how you sort of establish yourself as a non-invisible, as a visible member of society. That you also have earning power, which is kind of another discussion. But he thought that. Then after age 5 to 10, from ages 9 until about 15 and a half, you should, basically, you can be divided into another 2 groups. You're either part of the little hordes or the little bands. The little hordes are for people who are inherently ardent, forceful, or rebellious, and inclined toward dirt and filth. So these are people who are maybe violent, maybe destructive. These are teenagers, basically. These are the teenagers that we know go to parks and vandalize stuff. These are people with destructive or somehow energy, which he thought ought to be channeled in a productive way. And if you joined the little hordes, you would become, you basically became a city maintenance worker. So it was your job to clean the streets. It was your job to pick up the garbage, to really be the kind of maintenance worker of the city. If you were part of the little bands, you were sort of the opposite. So he was all about this kind of personality traits and how they can be best channeled. If you were part of the little bands, you were responsible for the care, protection, and surveillance of the domain of plants. You were basically the city gardening staff, and that was sort of your role. What's really compelling about Fourier is his stance on babies. He really thought that it was at babyhood, it was at the age of 2, or when a child could first walk, that you should find your vocation. So no later than that. As soon as you can walk, we should figure out what you're good at and put you to work. There's a couple reasons for this, not least of which is Fourier's sympathy for parents. He really felt like it's hell to be a parent, and that it would be much better for society if we took children away from their biological parents and just put them into this kind of large care facility and let the parents go along with their tasks. He called parenting a service of filth and repugnance which their weaknesses demand, the weaknesses of the child. So, he really had this idea. He was also not a parent himself. He thought that, he said, quote, "Nature endows every child with a great number of primary instincts, and it is the task of education to discover them. As soon as a child can walk, he or she is taken by the caretakers around to all the nearby workshops and industrial meeting places and given the opportunity for observation. Whenever appropriate, there will be a parallel industry in miniature with diminutive tools specially adapted for use by youngsters. In Harmony is the name of the place. In harmony, children of 2.5 to 3 years already work, and the newcomers will be anxious to join. He or she will rummage about, handle things, and at the end of a fortnight, it may be possible to discern what are the workshops that are attractive and what are their industrial instincts. All this activity by the infant goes to show that it is not true, as so many parents and teachers accuse, that children are little idlers. Not so, it's just that the correct industry needs to be found. And then finally, what I found really interesting about Fourier is that he has a kind of patience for kids as well. So he as in the tasks that he gives the children, he states very explicitly that it doesn't matter that the kid will do that much more slowly than an adult would. If you gave that job to an adult, they'd do it much faster. That doesn't matter. It's not about efficiency. It's about education. So the society, in some sense, is being held up in order to educate these kids. The example that he gives of a task is the shelling and sorting of peas. This task will be given to children ages 2, 3, and 4 instead of to adults. A specially inclined table with a number of hollows is provided. 2 infants will be seated at the raised side. They will take the peas out of the shell and arrange for them to roll down the inclined table. At the lower side, 3 infants, aged 25, 30, and 35 months, will sort out the peas, furnished with special implements, the smallest peas for the sweetened ragout, and the largest for the soup. So Fourier, he really thought a lot about babies. As you probably know, the work of Urban95 also is focused on babies, or specifically infants and toddlers, or kids up until 5, but really what we focus on is age 0 to 3. Thinking about babies today, at least, 2019, adds a couple of key dimensions to the conversation about childhood in cities. Firstly, babies are the most vulnerable group among us. 85% of brain development happens within the first 3 years. 92 by the first 5 years. So anything negative that happens to them from the built environment, such as air pollution to the brain and lungs. Which one do I? On the right. Have lasting effects. So when we talk about air pollution, usually we talk about the fact that, like a statistic that you hear in the news is like, air pollution is going to take 5 years off your life. Well, maybe that's true, but actually it's much worse than that, because if you are exposed to too much air pollution when you're 3, you can have learning defects that will affect you for the rest of your life, and learning defects and also asthma, like all kinds of physical changes to your body that you'll have to deal with for your entire life. So these are things which then also shorten your life. But the point is, babies give us a kind of lens to focus in on environmental harm in a way that is much more sort of succinct and compelling, I think, than just the category of kids at large. So it's also, the conflict there is that kids also really need to be outside. So kids really need to be in contact with fresh air. Kids need to be able to see distances. They need to be able to run. They need to be able to, again, like all of the kind of attributes of play that are so important for the physical development of kids, they need to be doing those things outside. And so all of the kind of urban design features, such as shade or drainage, that we tend to think about as belonging to the realm of kind of hard infrastructure, those are things that are really, really critical for babies. So, the built environment is crucial for the healthy development of babies. And this is, again, so babies I think are really interesting at this moment to talk about as a way for cities to enter into conversations about climate change and about resiliency. So resilient infrastructure, it's a term we hear all the time. But what does that really mean? Keeping the city cool. For example, in Paris, et cetera, you get these projects about kind of green oasis. These are about keeping the city cooler, but these are critical for babies. The second reason I think that babies are really compelling within, again, the conversation about childhood is the issue of gender. So the thing about an infant or a toddler is that they're never in the public realm alone. They will always be with a caregiver of some kind. A caregiver can be an older sibling, it can be a grandparent, usually it's the parent, and usually it's a female caregiver. And we know that there is if you're not talking about gender explicitly, then again it's being ignored because of the kind of habits that have been built up over time. And so it's really crucial, again, when you're talking about infant, toddler, caregiver, that gender remains at the forefront of the conversation. And this again is something that babies really, the conversation about babies in the public realm really does in an explicit way. So again, any neighborhood intervention thinking about infant, toddler, caregiver should also talk about resiliency of city infrastructure in the same stroke. That should be kind of one and the same. That argument is really combined. One of the examples of a group of urban activists that finally explicitly address gender in childhood. So it doesn't happen, right? Like all of the people that I was talking about were men for a long time. There's a couple members. There's Emma Goldman and there's Mary Wollstonecraft. There's a couple of figures who were talking about education, but it really becomes explicitly about gender in the urban realm much later. There's a group, a very interesting group that was in London in the 80s. Called Matrix, and they published this book among many others called Making Space, Women in the Man-Made Environment, and they again talk about parenting in the city as a practice, right? So what does the city enable or disable or prevent in terms of parenting, and how can those things or how should those things be changed? Quote, women live in an environment designed to enhance and therefore reinforce the norm of individual mobility. So again, we're talking about now about a caregiver and a kid, which is dependent mobility. So they're talking here immediately individual mobility, from plans for new road networks to move cars further and faster more efficiently, to housing estates located in suburban areas distant from places of paid employment. At the same time, this norm of mobility is perceived by men as a male prerogative. Many stereotypical ideas contain penalties for women who are mobile. This restriction on mobility has to be taught to girls. It is not a natural biological fact. Girl children are socialized off the street through an implanted fear of men, by restrictions on street games and activities, and by an emphasis on activities that concern grace rather than speed. Girls soon learn to take up as little space as possible to be allowed within the category female. So again, issues that are, what did I touched something, oops. Issues that are essential, this is really part of talking about the way that the idea of babies, how working on babies talks also about scale, right? So, talking about baby is often talking about the household, is often talking about a nursery, maybe some kind of local service. But I think what we're saying is talking about a baby is also talking about climate change. Or if you want to talk about resilient infrastructure, the way that a city approaches these things. So the idea of making a city that's good for a baby is also really, it's expansive. And in the same way, talking about baby has all of these gender implications that should be taken up, and again brings the idea of parenting from something that's quite small perhaps and quite personal into something that's really societal. And I think that's a kind of compelling way that thinking about babies within urban planning and design can really kind of stretch from the individual all the way to the global or to the universal. These are a couple of other images from the Matrix publication. Okay, so to talk a little bit about process. I mean, process is like, you know, process itself is education somehow, or at least that's how we think about it. So I think this quote I really like a lot, because I think, you know, in urban design, you know, or urban planning for a long time has been about so-called process. It's been about consultation, public participation, these kinds of processes. We've been talking about them for a long time, but I think that they're really not standard yet, especially where I work. And it's a constant struggle to figure out how these processes should actually work, and a constant struggle to make sure that these processes are actually ending up in positive ways. So you know, it's not that we know automatically what's good for society, but it's that through the process that public good emerges or becomes visible. So we work on again, like, kind of talking about education that happens at many levels, talking about mutual learning and exchange. It's not just that we're working on the city as a place of learning and exchange, but we try to build those processes into how we work as well. And so not only the project, but also how the project is made becomes kind of a conversation about pedagogy. So just a couple of projects about the pop-up is something that we don't have a lot of experience with, but the pop-up again it's a learning situation. You're doing something very fast that can basically, like, in order to find an ultimate or an eventual expression of something much more permanent. This is very much the kind of the language of NACTO as well. The work that NACTO does with painting streets in chalk that then become capital projects. These are all processes of learning. We're also very interested in the kind of publication as part of this practice. So leaving something behind, which is educating. And then finally, the Tirana Traffic Garden is a project that we're working on right now in collaboration with the Parks Department. So this process begins with a pop-up. These lines were drawn on the street, sort of in permanent paint, and sort of start to understand what's required of a traffic garden. But what we wanted to do in the design of the site itself is really give, first of all, kind of an understanding of the urban system of Tirana. So it's a miniature. What we're making essentially is a miniature city, a miniature version of Tirana from which these kids are going to learn from, so these are reproductions of real street types. There's a couple of different, you know, the National Road Code has specifications for how street types should work. So it's very important that it's very important that the traffic garden that these kids eventually learn from emulates those things. But it's also an opportunity. We wanted to take the opportunity of the traffic garden as a chance to build the future urban design features of Tirana. So ones that might not necessarily exist yet, or at least not very frequently, but so features like raised crossings, bulb outs, all the kind of, basically all of the kind of urban design features that are found in a set of design guidelines for infant, toddlers, and caregivers should exist on this site. And especially in terms of cycling infrastructure, which doesn't really exist in the city right now. So the project is very much about both teaching kids how to ride bikes, first of all, from the age of 2 or so, 2.5 or 3, but then also learning how to become a driver and how to essentially treat other people who are around you in the built environment when you're in charge of the vehicle. So it's kind of it's kind of a simulation of the city, and it's an opportunity for kids and adults as well to really sort of foresee future events in the street and how to deal with them. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. It was amazing also to see kind of putting all the work we're doing here into some kind of historical perspective and see that we could actually reach back and probably also learn something from back in time and not start from zero, which we should never do. I have a question to Simon, unless there's something really burning to jump in right away. But so actually, this thing about learning the city is very interesting. I'm just going to pull out an example from today, right? So we're changing this traffic routing of this square, and suddenly you have to relearn, or you can see the drivers have to relearn how to use that space. Suddenly they can't do what they normally did, and they kind of get confused. It's actually something that would be interesting to build into your bike park as well. That how do you learn a new system? Right, because they actually, of course, they will come back to that same intersection a couple of times, and then they'll say, okay, that's how it works. But actually, you need to, in a city like Istanbul, be prepared that every day your crossing can be some new layout because of whatever construction work or rerouting of traffic or so forth. So I think there's interesting that we need to train our capacity to encounter new things also in the traffic.
Yeah.
Just to pick on that, since that's what we ended with. Could you elaborate a little bit what your ideas are beyond the raised thing? What else are you going to teach the kids and this facility?
So there's a I mean, so that's a discussion that we've been having also. When we've presented it to a couple of people, and they say, okay, but what about how are they going to learn the Tirana that exists now? Because that's probably how it's going to be. Isn't it a little bit overly optimistic to design all of these urban design features that are pretty complicated and I think it's So what basically one side of it here has kind of a symbol road. So you can always go there. You can always say I think so that's one part of it. The other thing is just how do you teaching kids to deal with something that's unexpected. I think there's a set of rules for that. I think there's just kind of a set of protocols that can be given. I think the other thing that we're very interested in is that that this city is not one that actually even the city engineers know how to build necessarily, and the people who are the construction workers also probably haven't necessarily placed stone in such a way and it made the bike track. The only thing that's different is the dimensions. And so it's not, the things are never as wide because it's just for a kid. But thinking about how a raised crosswalk intersects with all of these different kinds of lanes, all of these modes that are going, it's literally not been built in the country, if not the region, ever. So it's also kind of a demonstration project for them to be able to put all of these materials together. And again, this kind of constant cycle of everybody's learning through the creation of a project like this is something that we're very interested in kind of, being part of that process.
I'm going to continue with someone raises. I'm also fascinated by this, what you brought out, that the city is a learning environment for us, right? I mean, basically you could claim that that's where you learn how to engage with other human beings, but it's also from where you learn from the shop owner, no, you're not supposed to, pick up my apples and throw them on the street, it's this fascinating machine, but at the same time we're repeating so many mistakes, at least when we're building city here, that I wonder how could we accelerate that learning?
Yeah.
We're hoping that what we're doing now out in Maltepe could be one way of teaching ourselves what is good public space.
Yeah.
But it's really, if you're imagining transforming a city of this size, like intersection by intersection, then it's going to take a long time. Right. I don't know if you have any insights on
I think we have to employ the kids. I think we have to get the kids, we have a shortage of workers because we're not employing them from the time that they're 2. I think I'm actually, I'm partially joking, but I'm always really compelled by these ideas, because I really think that I really think that kids, there's another book that I didn't include in the talk tonight called Haircuts by Children, but it's an artist project of this guy. He's Canadian, but basically he has little kids cut people's hair. He sets up in a hair salon anywhere in the world, and they're not just cutting hair, but they're really running the salon for the day. So they're taking reservations, and then it's like the 6-year-old kid is giving the haircut. And it's hilarious. But it's also really, he wrote this book about it, it's also really important to give kids the sense of responsibility and ownership over both themselves and their environment. And I think if we don't do that, I think the idea that we should just let childhood be free, just don't bother them, just let them be kids, I think I totally disagree with that. I'm not a parent, so I haven't really had this debate personally yet. But as a person who's thinking about society at that level, I think it makes so much sense to give, ensure that the city acknowledges and brings kids into what we're doing. They might not be interested in a lecture, but they'd probably be interested in having a full-time job as a worker moving dirt around the site. For the right kid, I really believe that would be an excellent year. So I really think that that they gain so much more from that than being kind of protected in the way that parents are so want to do. And so I really think that in that first photo, the issue again is just visibility. It's how are cities addressing themselves to kids? And I think that if they don't, and this is something that we talk about in Urban 95 all the time. In the Urban 95 playbook is all about signage. It's all about the wall at 95 centimeters has games. The city, it's creating an interface between the city and the kid. The Urban 95 philosophy from through and through is making the city talk to kids. And I really believe in that. I really think that the child should have, that the child should be at home, not just in their bedroom, but anywhere, and that's our responsibility as designers to make sure that happens.
Hi. Actually, as we've been struggling by the vandalism at parks in these days, especially in Sarıyer Park, yes. Do you have any recommendations to taking or getting these caution steps for struggling with this vandalism? I don't know.
Well, Somebody said something, which I didn't read. I think Colin Ward had something to say about vandalism, which I thought was really good. I'm not going to be able to find it now, but it's really, I mean, yeah, like I mean, we have our theory about it, but we have our theory about it in Tirana, but we haven't built any playgrounds yet. We haven't really tested it. My belief is that, I mean, at least, I don't know what the situation is. In Tirana, the vandalism tends to be a kind of expression of anger toward the government, explicitly. So if this mayor built a playground, if you want to say that I don't like you, the mayor, I'm going to break your playground that you just built. So in that context, what we say is you shouldn't build bright, colorful, or expensive playgrounds which somehow symbolize or somehow in some way sort of look like you. You should just build rocks and plants. And because those don't look like you, and I have a great picture from here actually, maybe in Serie, of a park with a bunch of large old birch trees with white bark that are totally written, everybody's written their name in this tree for like the last 20 years, and it's amazing. It's like super beautiful. And the idea being like, you can't really, what can you do really to a tree? I mean, you can kill a tree, but that's a little extreme. And it doesn't give much pleasure to a teenager, I don't think, you know? I think it's much more about like doing damage to something which is somehow symbolically relevant. And so, yeah, so we say, which I think is what you guys sort of do too, although I guess you have a little bit more structure there. But yeah, or, you know, give them like, and then of course there's all the stuff about the planning, somehow give them ownership of the place. I would say give them a job there. I would say make them the cleaners, just like Fourier would say, and then they won't. And then
yeah, we have 2 kids there who took the responsibility.
Really? Okay.
I don't know how they're really into it, but
yeah.
Hi, my name is Eni. I am from Tirana.
Hi.
First of all, I want to thank you for this open-minded ideas. I have not been living in Tirana for many years, so I am both surprised and happy that these ideas are being implemented there. So I have 2 questions. First is, why Tirana? Why you chose Tirana to implement these ideas, like amongst other cities or amongst other countries? And second one is because these children will not come by themselves; they'll be sent by their parents.
At here.
Yeah. So how cooperative are their parents on these ideas, and what is their feedback? Because by knowing my own people, like being very conservative, like not open to like such ideas, like I'm a big skeptic.
Well, I mean, the reason that I work in Tirana, probably a lot of it has to do with the political will that's there for getting work like this done, and the vision of the mayor and a lot of the people who work there right now who are really committed to this kind of stuff. It makes it like there aren't very many cities like it in the world where there's such an environment that this kind of work can be done. So that's probably why I'm still there. A lot of like the environment for this kind of conversation, the conversation about the way that the city is changing, how it should change, and who gets to have some say in that is very interesting and very rich at the moment, and something that I find like that I want to be a part of. So that's the work that I do. I don't know when you were there last. I've been in Tirana for 5 years, and I've noticed a huge change in the city and the people who are there in that time. So I think these kinds of changes happen very fast. I think basically when you start building good infrastructure for people, maybe there will be a little bit of debate in the beginning. You know, I don't want that there. Why is it that color, et cetera, et cetera. But once it's there and it's in place, people really love it within like weeks. So at this point, for example, the lake park in Tirana, the lake park is a pretty amazing place. It's got just quality infrastructure and like a lot of natural space that is inaccessible anywhere else in the city. There's not a lot of park space in Tirana, so that park, and this traffic garden would go there. That place is packed all the time. So I think when we've been doing these pop-ups, we get very good feedback also. Biking, you know, part of the project is like, if you're going to build a massive biking infrastructure in the city, all of it, you know, they've built like 100 and, what is it? No, I'm exaggerating. I think they built something like 70 kilometers of bike lanes or something in the city in the past 5 years. If you're going to build a grid of bike lanes, you also have to make sure that people know how to bike, and that's where this comes in. So I think you can't have all of a sudden a network of a new mode without making sure that people know how to use it. And I think people are really recognizing that biking is faster and free, you know, and so a lot of people are taking it on, and fun, you know. So it's a thing that kids should be doing. I think we see a lot of really positive reaction to this, to the pop-ups at least.
Okay, thank you.
First, no, I don't have any particular question. Actually, I was curious if you know the Montessorian education, that is where the children are put at the center, of course, the education method, because you mentioned mainly men, you know, you say before, but it is not so important. No, actually, it's not a question in terms of architecture, but I read that in some cities, for example, they plan, or let's say they set some days during the week in which children meet with elderly people, and they teach them. I mean, there is a kind of mutual teaching, let's say, and they do it in the parks. So I wonder if maybe these parks should be designed also for these people that, of course, are fine, but also weak somehow, like children, in different way, weak in different ways, of course. I don't know if you heard about it or if you do that. No,
I haven't heard of that specifically, but I think there's a huge that pairing of the very young and the elderly. It does happen a little bit there, and should much more. It's so obvious. It's just kind of waiting, and I think it's basically waiting for a space. It's waiting for a space. It's waiting for an obvious place where they can come together in a way that's kind of safe and comfortable for everybody. And I think, you know, there's a huge potential. The retirement age in Albania, I think, is 60. Is it 65 for men, and for women younger? 55 or 60. So, I mean, 55, that's like nothing. That's like so young. So you're not doing anything from the time that you're 55 except taking care of your own grandkids, maybe if you have them. But otherwise, like, imagine how involved you can get, either volunteer or it can also be paid job. But so there's a huge potential there for childcare. And of course, the other thing is like the childcare is a workforce issue. It doesn't, you know, if you have to take care of your kid, you're not inclined to go and get a job, et cetera, et cetera. So it's so voluntary domestic labor, which is the majority of how kids are taken care of, is unpaid. It's a huge portion of the economy that's not productive, so to speak, in those terms, you know. So there's, like if you have volunteer, the 55-year-old woman who doesn't have a job, she's taking care of your kid, and now you can go get a job. So these systems are super, super important to start. And again, I really think it's all about the space. You know, I think everything that I talked about tonight is fundamentally about a particular place. Even if we're talking about it in loose terms, it's just it's like the city. It's a spot in the city where like everybody, but it's not everywhere. It is focused on a particular place. When you think, you know, the big basement, et cetera, like all of these places are somehow at one point. And the idea of the community center as well, for us, is like, it's the place where everybody can walk. It's close to where everybody lives, and therefore it's the most convenient. You don't have to drive there. You're just there often, easily. That's really kind of the key.
Yep.
Hi. Earlier you have mentioned a writer whose ideas was really interesting, and as you said, it was the funniest one. I guess his name was Fourier. How can we spell that name?
F-O-U-R-I-E-R.
May you say that again?
F-O-U-R-I-E-R. Fourier.
What's his name?
Charles.
Thank you.
Actually, so there's a very good book about him. Reading him, I don't know if you speak French. I don't, and his explicit writing is not translated very well. But the book, I can't remember it right now. I'll tell you after. There's a very good book about him that was written in the late '60s. That's like excellent, and specifically about his education. I think it's called The Educational Ideas of Charles Fourier. Like 1740 blah to blah blah blah, like that's the title, and yeah, it's out of print, but you can find digital copies.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm really curious about the effects of the technology in your projects, because the technology become the most important enemy of the children, especially
Screens.
Sorry?
Screen time. You mean yeah.
And also the parents are getting rid of their children by showing the smartphones and YouTube and other etc. And also it leads to autism in the early ages. Maybe you know that too also. So for example, my brother is 19 years old in the X generation, so he is an adult man. So, for example, he's not choosing to go out with his friends anymore. In the last summer, he was completely free and didn't go out with his friends in any time for 3 months. Also, he's an adult and has a brain to use it. So, and on the other hand...
You sound like his dad.
Yeah. So, and on the other hand, like 3 or 4 years ago, there's a mobile game, Pokemon, maybe you know it, and it doubled the occupation and population of these parks in a month. In the two times more people are going to parks, chatting around people, meeting around people, even they marry with these applications. So there's a both sides in the like a knife pack. So what do you think about it? Thank you for your presentation again.
I ask the question about screens fairly often to kind of early childhood people or people within the Urban95 network. And I don't find very many people who are willing to take a bold stance against them still, which I find strange, because to me, my impression of them is that they're just horrible. Again, I haven't dealt with having a kid, so I think it's like, I think you have to maybe be there to understand the kind of pressure that's coming from their friends and et cetera, et cetera. I would say tonight that I will never allow a kid around me to look at a screen of any kind. Yeah, I think like I have a couple, I just think that what we talk about in the, again, I'm not an early childhood development expert, I just sort of know the bits of it that are relevant to the built environment, and we talk about you know, running around, we talk about play as a physical experience, understanding the relationship of the body to the world. And that even though it's physical, it's incredibly mental. That's how the brain also develops and grows. And so those, like, those kinds of experiences aren't available on screen, actually. So some kinds of learning, sure, they say that as long as the parent is around and interpreting for you. I'm just telling you what I've read in the news, but really, like, I think if you have to have a screen as an excuse to go outside, it's sort of like a bit maybe too late for you. I mean, I think again from the perspective of the city, not talking about parenting, not talking about choices that individuals make. It's our responsibility as planners to make sure that public spaces are really good, really engaging, and really accessible. And I really believe that if you make them that way, and make sure that they're free, that people will use them and enjoy them. And I think it's not about scolding or behavior, like telling people a certain thing about what to do. I think it's just when you provide that, when the city provides those kinds of spaces, you will get the kind of response in behavior that you're after, which is somehow the healthier one.
Hi, I have a question about the schoolyards project that was really interesting, that the school is the center of the neighborhood. And how the society in Tirana that like approach to opening schoolyards, like other than school time? Because I find it's really hard in Turkey, especially, I don't know, in maybe small neighborhoods it's easier, but like a city like Istanbul is really hard to open it 24 hours. Yeah. How is it in Tirana?
Yeah. So I don't, like the Boeri schools that they're saying are going to be open 24 hours, I don't know how they're dealing with the logistics of that. I don't know how realistic it is. It's something that they said like a year and a half ago. They still haven't broken ground. So there's a lot of that stuff to be worked out still. I'm not sure how the 24 hours will work. When we talk to parents and teachers about opening the school, we get there's a lot of concern. There's a lot of concern from the city as well, especially about maintenance, about the vandalism question. Oh, what Colin Ward says is that you should open the school. The more that it's open, the more eyes you have in the Jane Jacobs sense, and the less chance there is for vandalism, in fact. In Tirana, that's not really true, because there's one gate, and they lock it, and no one goes in. So if you have people, there are a few schools in Tirana that have no gate whatsoever. There's one that just opened, actually, one of these new 17 that completed construction, and at the street level, it's totally open. Inside the courtyard, there's a small gate that connects to the door, but the majority of the site is totally open to the public, which I think is encouraging. I mean, I think that somehow indicates the city's willingness to do this. But yeah, I mean, again, I think it's one of those things where there's a lot of fear of the unknown, and getting people to understand, all you can do is say, well, hey, they do it in Copenhagen, and that's not very convincing, so they like, the people who are really concerned with the daily maintenance and like the nitty-gritty of operations of a school are very worried about this. And I think it's one of those things where it's like, it's a really huge hurdle to get everybody over it, and we're just starting that process now, so we're not really very far with actually making sure that this relationship works with the city. In our schools, in the neighborhood schools, we're not proposing 24 hours, we're just proposing after school and weekends, which is a bit different. But basically it requires one employee, it requires a staff member, and if it's a kid it's even better. But you just need to hire one person, and then maintenance all of a sudden is like, it's not an issue, right? It's just, the problem is when you try to make big changes like this and don't spend any money on it. So you have to spend the money, that's the thing. Just budget for it and it's all good. But if you don't, if you try to squeeze more and more out of people without compensation, that's when you get anger and frustration, I think.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just a little bit of planning of the building also probably helps beforehand. So things you don't want to access to after hours can be locked off, and gyms and whatnot can be easily accessible.
Right.
Anyhow, any more questions? Sure.
for the speech first. My name is Beide. I'm an interior architect. So actually, I know that you mentioned that we have really, not only for Tirana, we have really have less green areas, not only Tirana and anywhere. So kids have to have indoor activities also. Do you have any ideas about indoor activities? I know the whole study is about scale. Maybe you can recommend any.
Well, so you have to come tomorrow. This is the plug for the event tomorrow. I'll be in conversation with a person who is focused on interior design for kids.
Okay.
But I'm the outside guy, so I can't answer.
Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, I would just say skylights, or at least like open, get fresh air at the very least.
Okay, but maybe we can talk about that event tomorrow, just after. I can let you know. But thank you so much. I think that was a really good discussion we had here in the early hours of the evening. Thank you for coming, and back out mixing in the city.